it's going to be pretty easy, I think, for OpenAI to make the case that what we are doing is innovative and it is to the broader benefit. And that is going to, that I think is going to make it hard for the Times to win, particularly when their main point is the sort of potential market. Because the irony of this sort of point number 4, the effect of the use upon the potential market for value of the copyrighted work, is that I actually think that AI is good for the New York Times, right?
Interesting. Explain.
When the world becomes awash in content to an even greater extent than it is today, the value of brand is only going to increase. The value of sort of reputation. Now, of course, there's some people who are listening to us like, oh, the New York Times brand is terrible. But like that, your distaste for that brand is offset by the deepening trust and embrace of that brand by sort of other folks that sort of agree with you. And everyone sort of knows, the New York Times, what is, maybe they have a particular political point of view, but they also have like 1,500 reporters and they spend a lot of resources and there's a lot of facts in their articles, right?
That was part of the lawsuit that I saw a number of people having fun with. Like there were 4 or 5 pages of puffery talking about how amazing the New York Times is and this ambitious journalism they do all over the world. And some people were rolling their eyes there. But that is ultimately part of their case, which is that this takes money. We spend the money, and the Constitution has incentivized people to spend the money by imbuing them with intellectual property rights and copyright, and that's being violated. And that's what's ultimately at stake here is that model. So it's just a rejoinder to some of the people who are snarking at some of the New York Times stuff and basically looking at it as the New York Times sniffing its own farts. That's not what was happening in the lawsuit there.
Well, maybe a little bit, but
sure.
No, but that's why I put that out there, right? Like the fact of the matter is the New York Times has earned the right to have everyone making fun of them for sniffing their farts, right? Everyone cares about the New York Times, even if they hate the New York Times.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And even if you hate like half of the New York Times, they do a lot of really good, ambitious journalism that only they have the resources to do.
Right.
So the New York Times is not a monolith, I think.
The New York Times tech section versus tech we've talked about it. I've written about it. Like it is a thing for sure. But again, it's a thing also because they invest in it being a thing, right? Like I wrote that article years ago in defense of the New York Times, and it's true. And so that is something valuable that is sort of worth protecting. And I think that value is only going to increase in this world of generic content, right? The fact that you can look at the URL, it's NYTimes.com, or you can open their app. That is actually going to become more valuable, not less, as this as this world sort of proliferates. So it is ironic that the point that is arguably most in their favor of this sort of test, I would argue, actually goes in the other direction.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly the point that all of these companies are going to have to argue as they try to sue different AI companies, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. And it's pretty speculative right now because ChatGPT is certainly a phenomenon, but I wouldn't say that it's replaced reading the New York Times.
No, well, here's an example. So this is well known. So I have some group chats where everyone knows that I have a subscription to everything, right? And so some random article will come up to like, oh, can I get a PDF of this, right? And maybe I should scratch this, but there is a capability in iOS to sort of print an article and then you can share it. And that is work. I have to go through some tedious steps, but it's actually easier than trying to prompt ChatGPT to get an article from like 5 years ago. Should the New York Times sue Apple because of that capability, right? Should they sue any phone that can take screenshots? Because that's the sort of level of thing that's happening here. And, again, for the specific sort of in this case. Now, again, there's this broader point about this distaste and discomfort with the fact these LLMs scrape the whole internet, right?
Yeah.
And there are companies like Reddit, for example, that I'm sure are watching this case very closely, or Stack Overflow or whatever it might be, where their content went into, is an important factor of these being sort of compelling. But and so it's not just sort of the specific. I think that's to your point. It's a red herring. That's actually not what's at issue here. There's a bit where we've been spending money on content, or in the case of like a Reddit, we've been spending money to run a service for years and years and years. and suddenly there's this huge opportunity that of which we are an essential input, and we ought to have access to that. And you can you can understand exactly why they would make this case.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, honestly, it's downstream of two themes that recur over and over again in the modern tech conversation, which is, number one, you have regulators and media today trying to be extra vigilant after basically ignoring tech and not taking tech seriously for the first 15 years of this century. And
society's benefit.
Well, they've now realized you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube with like the WhatsApp acquisition for Facebook or the Instagram acquisition or Google and Android, or you can go right down the list, stuff that just nobody cared about at the time. And now people are like, wow, okay, so why did we set it up this way? And I think there's the worry is that, okay, if we don't take action now, what will happen to us? Is ChatGPT just going to eat the internet and become the internet for everybody? I don't really think that's a genuine concern. I mean, like, you go back to Napster, another difference between this and Napster is that Napster was incredibly useful, whereas ChatGPT, we've been over this, a bit of a parlor trick that gets old after 20 minutes or so. So I don't personally take it
prized
that
by
seriously.
college students.
That's right. ChatGPT, very important to college students who are just trying to get a B- or a B and make it through. That said, though, I was thinking about the Napster stuff because I dismissed it out of hand when people were like, this is ChatGPT's Napster moment. And then I thought about it a little more. There are some broad similarities where, like, obviously, number one, Napster was this massively successful cultural phenomenon that then had this glaring Achilles heel, which is essentially, don't ask about copyright law that may or may not apply to what's happening here. That has been the story with ChatGPT for a while now. But I think the real problem with Napster in the end was that the scale of the infringement that the platform was facilitating was just massive. And so the simple act of downloading a song from me to you doesn't necessarily create like urgent copyright concerns. But if you're suddenly going to have 50 million or 100 million people acquiring music that way, and then eventually acquiring movies that way, then that poses risks to the entire entertainment business. And so,
demonstrable risks, right? You can look at the revenue
obvious
numbers.
Risk. Yes, yep. Exactly. By the time Napster went crashing down, you were already seeing the impact. Whereas this, it's more speculative. But with OpenAI, it's not that any one news article is important to the LLM. It's not even necessarily that any one news organization is important to the LLM. But if technology makes it possible to train on every piece of media in existence and eventually create a competing media product, then that's going to raise understandable copyright concerns. And it does sort of go to the heart of why this exists.
I was with you all the way to the very end.
Okay.
It's going to raise understandable what is the long run value of my business concerns. But that's not copyright concerns. And I think that is the important distinction. At the end of the day, there is a broader discussion about the business impact of AI, just like there was about the business impact of the internet, right? On all these sorts of things. That's distinct from, is there a crime being committed here? Is there a copyright violation happening? And now, to be fair, this does get to point number 4, which I think you're referring to, the effective use upon the potential market. But I do think it's important to draw this distinction. This gets back to some of our antitrust debates, which is, it really sucks to be a supplier for Amazon, or it really sucks to be a publisher wanting to get links on Facebook or Google. But whether it really sucks is distinct from, is there an actual violation of law happening here?
Well, and that's part of what's so interesting. Thinking through all this, it actually reminded me of Amazon, not the antitrust concerns per se, but the pricing algorithm, the Project Nessie stuff.
It's the scale. This is the question of all this. It's the scale. The scale makes it feel different.
Yeah, it changes the nature of what's happening so that you have a business practice that has existed in Amazon's case, like the idea of monitoring your competitors' prices has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. But if you're monitoring like thousands and thousands of categories 24 hours a day constantly, it sort of changes the nature of what's happening.
It feels bad.
At least arguably. Yeah. So whether it's illegal or unethical is sort of an open question.
I'm laughing at you, but I completely agree. Like the you know, and this is, this is my frustration around the Amazon thing, which is I actually completely agree that it is different, right? Being able to track every price in the world at a moment's notice and adjust yours on the fly, that is fundamentally different than I have a shop and I walk down the street and I see the other shop has a lower price. So I walk back and I get on my label printer and I make a new price, right? It's just
Yeah.
fundamentally different. The problem is that under the law, there is no distinction for scale. Now, again, the laws can be written and laws can be changed, which has always been my position. If you do think there's a change, then the answer is to make a law for this situation. And I think that applies here. My view on this is I don't think the New York Times has a case here. I think they ought to, under all precedent, should lose in court. I think it's fundamentally transformative. I think the innovation angle tips in the favor of OpenAI and against the New York Times. And I will even set aside what I think is true, which is that I think this is actually good for the New York Times business. It's terrible for like all the random aggregators in the world, but it's great for the New York Times sort of specifically. But set that one aside. I think on the merits of this case, I think they should lose. That said, I will be sympathetic to, I'm not sure I will support, but I will understand if they want to propose a law about this, about scrape, that there is something fundamentally different here. And I think this, to the point, applies to lots of stuff on the internet. Scale does change things. Yes, you can zoom out and it's all a spectrum, but at some point when you're dealing with the difference between a human capability and the capability of computers, it becomes something different. And I think that's totally valid.
Behavior becomes a concern.
Right. But that transition, that shift, that calls for new laws. It doesn't call for perverting the laws that we have, which were written for another era.